Okay. Hello everyone. Don't mind my background. I'm just recovering from a surgery. It's a laparoscopy. And once I do recover, I intend to make a video on my entire recovery journey and how long it took for me to be able to walk, to be able to get back at my pre-surgery fitness levels, what precautions you have to take, etc. etc. But I'm not there yet. So, in the middle, I wanted to talk about something else. I'm reading this book. It's called Incognito by David Eagleman, and this is around from 2011, I think. So, this is basically a book on neuroscience, on the functioning of the brain. But it's not very hardcore neuroscience. It's still accessible to people while telling them a lot of new things that they don't really know. The thing is, neuroscience has come such a long way from 2011 to today, and we see that also in the developments of AI, because a lot of the things that we try to do with artificial intelligence, we kind of try to model it on the things about our own intelligence that we know or we speculate. So, we needless to say, the world is completely different compared to 2011. And neuroscience research and the research about how the brain works also has come a long way. But the thing is, the world of the brain is so fascinating, and it's like we are the brain studying the brain, because in many ways it is like we are studying ourselves, and so many things about our own behavior we take completely for granted. Actually, 99.99% of the things that we do, we take them for granted completely, unless one day there is some form of a breakdown, like there is a malfunction. Only it is only then that we begin to even question what are the processes running this system, and where has an error occurred for this malfunction to have taken place. So, even though my point is, even though we have made tremendous progress in our knowledge of neuroscience as a species since 2011, this book will still largely surprise you and blow your mind, because you take your mind for granted. And when you read about it like this, in this technical format, suddenly your eyes open to this new world, to your own behaviors, to the systems running within your own mind, and how much you take them for granted. So, this book will blow your mind, even if you think that certain parts of it are just a tad bit dated. For the most part, it will really be a very interesting read. So, that's number one, that's out of the way. I was reading a case, right? This is chapter 6, why blameworthiness is the wrong question. And page 151, I have come across the case of what is now known as the Texas Tower Killer, I think. This is basically a man in his 40s. A normal man has served as a Marine veteran, then he has served as a teller in a bank. He has a wife, he perhaps has a kid, I don't know. But a normal man known as Charles Whitman, I think, or is it Whiteman? I think it's Whitman, Charles Whitman. And then one day he murders his wife out of nowhere, and probably also his mom, I'm not sure. Please check. And then he climbs up on a tower in Austin and shoots um, on completely unsuspecting people, like a mass shooting, a bunch of people who he doesn't know. And he ends up killing around 13 people, I think, 13 or 14 people, and injuring a few other people. He also kills himself, and when investigations are investigations go further, cops discover that he had written notes to himself, and not just on the day of the killing or on the previous day. he had been writing notes to himself for a while, I think for a few months now. And in those notes, he had repeatedly mentioned having these violent, compulsive thoughts in his head, like intrusive thoughts of wanting to hurt people for no reason whatsoever. And those thoughts were getting increasingly out of control, but the other part of his brain, the conscious part of his brain, was kind of aware of what was happening. But he just repeatedly wrote that those were parts that he was increasingly finding difficult to control. So that's that. The day that he shot his wife, he also noted it down in his diary, and he said that he is aware of what he has done, and his wife was a great wife. There was no marital problem that caused him to do that. And then the day he shot the people on the tower, he also noted it down, showing complete awareness of what he had done, and also, in fact, requesting the authorities after he dies to study his brain. And there was also in his history, he had also gone to a psychiatrist at some point, I believe. He had only had one session with that psychiatrist where he spoke about how his violent thoughts were becoming stronger and stronger. And then he didn't continue the treatment, or something happened. I don't know what happened. But since then, he had kind of been battling this idea alone himself. And they also asked his friend, a close friend, and reportedly that friend said that on the outside there was nothing visibly wrong with the behavior of Mr. Charles Whitman, but he could see that it was almost like there was a part of him that he was trying to control always. Those are the words of the friend who, like, while recounting his experience with this man, spoke about how he used to behave in his last days. Interestingly enough, his brain was taken to study. They used a bone saw to cut his brain, and what they discovered was there was a tumor the diameter of a nickel, I think, right above his amygdala, like somewhere between his hippocampus and amygdala. It was basically pressing on that amygdala more and more. As the tumor became bigger, it was pressing on that region of the brain more and more. And this is basically the region responsible for, of course, now we know all regions of the brain kind of communicate with each other and they act in an interconnected fashion. But this is basically the region responsible for fear responses, stress responses. When you are under acute stress, amygdala gets activated. There's a lot of activity in amygdala. So, anyways, it was pressing on his amygdala. So, that could kind of explain a lot of his violent behavior. However, the writer has asked, Mr. David Eagleman has asked, if today there was such a case and if he had been alive, how much of his behavior would be excused legally or exonerated legally because of what was medically found in his brain? And the thing with me is, I thought over it and I thought, well, there was certain degree of planning involved in what he did. So he chose his victims uh, in a way that they were always unsuspecting people who would not fight back or um, who would not suspect violence from his end. It was his own wife, it was those 13, 14 unsuspecting people on a tower. And a part of him was aware. Could he, if he really felt like his violence was out of control, could he not have chosen perhaps somebody guilty, like somebody, like a criminal, or perhaps an animal? These are questions that I ask myself. I don't know. because he seemed to be in conscious control of his actions enough that he did the required planning. It's not something that happened out of plan, like spontaneously. Spontaneously would be he starts throwing shit around, he starts hitting stuff. It wasn't exactly like that. There was a certain reasonable degree of conscious planning involved in what he did. So, how out of control was he really? But then also in his suicide note, he specifically asked people to study his mind. So, this is like, and physically they found a tumor. So, this is what makes this case kind of very difficult for me to morally, like, where do you put it? It belongs in a gray zone of sorts. But here's what my fear is, right? Now this is the case where you specifically found a tumor in this man's brain. However, there was another book that I had read, and this book is a pretty famous book as well. I started reading it, I didn't finish it. This book is known as The Body Keeps the Score. And I started reading this book, this was years ago, okay, in 2019-ish. And I'm sitting on my bed, I'm laying down on my bed, I'm reading this book. And on the first or the second page, somewhere, the author mentions the story of this Vietnam War soldier, actively in combat. And one day, he watches his friend die at a close distance, either because something that came from the air or he was shot. So him and his friend are fighting and he watches his friend die. And as per the writer, this guy was so traumatized seeing his friend die that the next day he went out and he raped a woman in Vietnam and he killed a child. And I remember just having this violent reaction to this paragraph and the way it was phrased, and I was like, this is not a book that I'm reading. I'm not reading this. I never read it. I have no intentions of reading it. This gray area that we create, it creates a lot of problems because 9/11 happened. How many people who watched a building collapse did you see out on the street the next day looking for women to rape in New York, in the city of New York? How many people do you see? This is a very dangerous idea to carry. I don't think you can forget that trauma is not going to make a person into a rapist. That's not what trauma does. We all have trauma, all of us. There are a lot of things involved in that situation. Number one and the most important thing is that this man, this US troop fighting in Vietnam, he knew that he was fighting in foreign land where accountability was bare minimum. He understood at some level in his psyche that the things that he did there, he would not be held accountable for those things, most likely in his country. He also didn't he was also operating from this psychology of us versus them, where he from the get-go dehumanized anybody who was not American or who was not white, and thereby he deemed that there was lesser value to this person's life. He believed that there was a level of entitlement that he was operating from because he was already killing people in that land. So you see the same thing in people who are acting in situations. By the way, the third thing is, I think he had read stories of US troops who had done it, or troops who end up committing acts of horrific, pathologically psychopathic violence. And he somewhere understood that those men are still humanized. In our culture, there is a certain group of extremely violent men that still get humanization. We still find humanity in them. Although if you ask me, the level of psychopathic dissociation that is required to not just put another human being in a situation of extreme distress while they are getting raped, while they are getting assaulted, not just to put them through that and watch it, but also to be able to get off on it, to be able to do it and then get off on it. That is pathological levels of dissociation, lack of empathy, and sadism. And a person whose mind is of that type, they don't deserve any humanization whatsoever, no matter what kind of a situation they are in. But our culture humanizes men like that, who commits horrific acts of atrocity. You call them traumatized. So somewhere in this person's head also, there is this idea that he can do something like this and he will still be humanized. I think of entitlement, lack of empathy, perceived lack of accountability, knowing that he will be humanized even if he does this, all of these things count. Because once again, I ask you this question: after 9/11, how many men were out on the street the next day trying to rape random women? You wouldn't find that. Um, in cases of domestic violence, in cases of abuse, you often see that perpetrators are selectively abusive. So this man has been beating the shit out of his wife for the past 15 years, and he is very polite to the boss. He is very polite to the woman outside on the street who he believes he can't harm as easily and get away with. There is this very particular woman that he chooses to um, harm over and over again. Same you see in cases of abusive relationships. The abuser is not abusive to the rest of the world, otherwise he would not survive in the world. Selectively, there is this tendency to choose who you can get away with. Similarly, you see this also in case of mothers, because also it depends on what society normalizes. If as a society we normalize the idea that a man can be a rapist or a man can be an abuser and still he deserves to be seen in good light, at least partially, we kind of give licenses to men to do that. Similarly, as a society, if we propagate this idea that a mother can never be wrong, if you, once you become a mother, you transcend humanity and you can never be abusive, you kind of give women the license to be their most horrific selves with their children and to never have to feel that they have done anything wrong. And you see that a lot of mothers are also very abusive, and they are very cruel to their own children, but somewhere in their heads they have this thing that whatever they do to this child, it will not be called abuse. So if you start to, that is why again and again I keep talking about movies where we try to find humanity in abusers. We always show these men who are very abusive to this woman, and then we try to find humanity in them. And we have in Bollywood a lot of movies where not just are we trying to find humanity in abusive men, we are glorifying them. uh, I think overall it leads to this cultural idea that I can do something as fucked up as that and I can still believe that I'm a good human being. And it kind of shifts the needle to this side where a person, a man experiencing a little bit disharmony in his head, can convince himself that he can go and abuse a woman and that's a viable option and he will still be, once he decides to get better, he will still be deemed as a good man. A woman experiencing a little disharmony in her head can be told that she can do it to her daughter or her son or her daughter-in-law, whoever, and she can still then later choose to be a good person once she is good. So anyways, this question of blameworthiness, I know that physical changes in the brain cannot and should not be considered as nothing. And our brains are largely things that are not in our control as much as we believe that they are. Otherwise, a person who's depressed for the last 10 years, who's battling depression, could just be like, I don't want to be depressed anymore. And I would understand it before anybody else. But also, the other extreme is extremely dangerous, where you say trauma creates abusers, trauma creates rapists. A lot of people have trauma, and this create, and also when you propagate this idea in society that your brain can be used as an excuse to harm other people, while half of your brain is still capable of planning and plotting and selecting who to abuse, this is a very dangerous idea to sell to society. I often ask myself, I would never go back to reading that book, by the way. I would never read like The Body Keeps the Score. I don't care what the writer's intention was. Once a man says this man raped this woman in a foreign land because he was extremely traumatized, I disengage. I'm like, trauma doesn't create rapists. A lot of women are traumatized. Do you see them going out and raping other men or children? But for this, the case of Charles Whitman, I think I'm a little bit more sympathetic. Even though he did choose unsuspecting victims, I do understand this entire concept of intrusive thoughts, and yeah, I ask myself what the right approach is, what this question of blameworthiness indicates. What do you guys think? Because this is a spectrum, there is no clear answer. Even when today, when you have to prove medical insanity, it's in the field of criminology, it's such a gray area. It's so difficult. Who is not insane? Who amongst us doesn't have some insanity within ourselves? I don't know. Please give me your thoughts. This is one issue that I am not completely clear about, and I would love to know your opinions. Thank you.